In the deepest folds of the Arkansas Ozarks, where the hollows hold secrets like cupped hands hold water, there's a name the locals only whisper, Sorrowseed. They say time doesn't just pass differently up on that ridge. They say it died there sometime around the turn of the last century. The dirt roads that lead that way have been reclaimed by kudzu and fear. And the story of the family that lived there, well, that's a story most folks would pay to forget. But we're going to remember it. Hello everyone and welcome to Macabre Mysteries of America. If you want to make sure you keep seeing stories just like this one, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Now, let's talk about what happened at Cain's Landing. In 1931, a census taker named Arthur Vance, a man of ledgers and logic, hiked into a part of the mountains his maps marked as empty. What he found there would shatter his understanding of the world. Tucked away in a forgotten valley was a small, self-contained world ruled by a patriarch named Cain. And in the official report Vance would later file, a report that was immediately sealed by a horrified judge, he described a family structure so warped, so fundamentally wrong, that it defied every law of God and man. This isn't just a story of isolation, though the mountains were their fortress and their prison. This isn't a tale of poverty, though they lived on little more than faith and fear. This is a story about a doctrine so poisonous it twisted the very meaning of family into a nightmare. A doctrine that taught a young woman her sacred duty was to bear children for her own father. They called her Elspeth. The old-timers who remembered seeing her as a child said she had one eye as blue as a summer sky and one as white as milk bone. They said it was the devil's mark, a sign of the sin she was born into. But the truth of Elspeth Cain is far more tragic than any backwoods superstition. It's a story of how faith, when poisoned by madness, can create a hell on earth. What you are about to hear has been pieced together from sealed court documents, a handful of terrified testimonies, and the fragments of a journal found in the ashes of a burned-down cabin. These details have been buried for nearly a century, and for good reason. The Sorrowseed clan first clawed their home out of the Ozark wilderness in the 1860s. The patriarch, Cain, wasn't just a farmer, he was a prophet. A preacher of a gospel he invented himself, what he called the gospel of the sealed vein. He was a man who could twist scripture until it bled, convincing his followers, his own family, that they were the last pure bloodline on earth, a direct, unbroken line from the Garden of Eden. He taught them that the world outside their valley was a sea of corruption, a fallen place where the blood of humanity had been thinned and tainted. Their blood, he preached, was sacred, a holy inheritance that had to be protected at all costs. To mix their blood with an outsider's was the only unforgivable sin. It was a betrayal of God's perfect design, and Cain was God's chosen guardian of that design. By 1900, Cain's Landing was a closed loop. A handful of crude cabins, a small, windowless chapel, and a graveyard already dotted with the small, unmarked stones of children who didn't survive the purity of their own blood. No one came in, and no one ever left. Silas's daughter, Seraphina, was his first and most devout disciple. She had grown up hearing her father's sermons echo off the valley walls, believing his every word as if it came from the mouth of God himself. She saw the world through his eyes, a world of saints and sinners, of the pure and the damned, and she was one of the pure. So when her father told her it was God's will that she marry her own brother to keep the bloodline sealed, she did so without question. It was a holy act, a sacrament. What the outside world called sin, they called salvation. But that was only the beginning of the nightmare. Seraphina had already borne her father 2 sons, children who were born silent and still, their bodies twisted by the family's sacred secret. And then in 1905 she gave birth to a daughter, a girl they named Elspeth. The moment Cain laid eyes on the child, he declared her a miracle, a sign from God that their path was righteous, because Elspeth was born with one eye a piercing blue and the other a clouded, milky white. She was marked, he said, marked for a divine purpose that would seal their family's holy covenant for another generation. Elspeth's childhood was not one of fairy tales and lullabies. It was a relentless education in the gospel of the sealed vein. Her only book was the one her own father had written, the Book of Cain, a collection of rewritten scriptures and prophetic ramblings bound in cracked leather. She learned to read from its pages, tracing the words with her small fingers, words that told her she was special, chosen. Her grandfather, Silas W., would sit her on his knee for hours in the dim light of the chapel. He'd point to the hand-drawn genealogies that covered the walls, showing her the sacred, unbroken line of their blood. He told her stories of biblical patriarchs who took wives from their own kin to preserve their holy lineage. He taught her that her body was not her own. It was a temple, a vessel meant to carry the future of their bloodline. Her mother, Seraphina, reinforced the lessons with a quiet, desperate intensity. She had become a ghost of a woman, her eyes always wide with a mixture of religious fervor and unspoken terror. She would brush Elspeth's hair, her hands trembling, whispering that she was the family's salvation, the pure seed. When Elspeth would ask why the children she sometimes glimpsed from the ridge top, the children of loggers or hunters, didn't look like her, why her own eye was different, her mother would pull her close. She'd whisper that her white eye was a sign of her purity, a divine mark that set her apart from the fallen world. But it wasn't a blessing. It was a warning, a physical manifestation of the genetic poison that had been concentrating in their veins for generations. There were no mirrors in Cain's landing. Silas had forbidden them, calling them tools of vanity. Elspeth never truly saw her own face. She only knew herself through the reflection in her family's eyes, and in them she saw a savior. She was being groomed not with cruelty but with a suffocating, absolute love. Every question was a doubt. Every doubt was a sin. Every sin pushed her further from God's grace. And God's grace was the only thing that mattered in their isolated world. As she blossomed into a young woman, the lessons began to shift. Silas started speaking of her sacred obligation. He spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the ultimate act of faith, the sacrifice she was destined to make to ensure the survival of their pure blood. He was no longer just her father and grandfather. He was becoming something more, something terrifying. Seraphina's whispers became more frantic. She would hold Elspeth's face in her hands, her eyes searching for any sign of rebellion, any flicker of doubt. She was preparing her daughter for the altar, and in her broken mind, it was the greatest act of motherly love she could possibly offer. The winter of 1920 descended on the Ozarks with a brutal, icy grip, and it was in the suffocating silence of that winter that Elspeth Cain's childhood came to an end. What happened to Elspeth in the windowless chapel of Cain's Landing can only be pieced together from the scattered, terrified whispers of her younger siblings, words spoken to a disbelieving sheriff years later. It began with the purification rites. Silas had declared that Elspeth, now 15, was ready to fulfill her divine purpose. He led her to a hidden spring deep in the woods, a place he called the Font of Eden. He told her that the freezing water was holy, that it would wash away any lingering traces of worldly corruption and prepare her for her sacred union. The rituals were long and agonizing. Hours of chanting, fasting, and forced prayer in the biting cold, all while Silas spoke of her holy destiny. He was breaking her spirit piece by piece and rebuilding it in the image of his own madness. Her mother, Seraphina, was his willing accomplice. She would wrap the shivering Elspeth in white linen, her hands anointed with oil, whispering that the pain was a blessing, that her suffering was a prayer. In Seraphina's eyes, she wasn't sacrificing her daughter to a monster. She was presenting her to God. The psychological torment was absolute. Elspeth was taught that her fear was a test of faith. Her revulsion was a sign of sin. Her tears were proof that the devil was trying to claim her soul. Every natural, human instinct was twisted and reframed as a spiritual battle she had to win. And to lose that battle meant eternal damnation, not just for her, but for her entire family. She was trapped. There was no one to cry out to, no one to save her. The God she prayed to was the same God her father claimed to be. If you're still with us, you're a part of this story now. Let us know in the comments, what do you think was going through the mother's mind? Subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America to keep the search for answers alive. The final ceremony took place on the night of the winter solstice. The chapel was lit by a single flickering lantern. Silas stood at the crude wooden altar, dressed in robes Seraphina had stitched from sackcloth. Elspeth was brought before him, a ghost in white linen, her blue eye wide with terror, her white eye staring into nothingness. Her family, her brothers, her sisters, who were also her uncles and aunts, watched from the shadows. This was not just a ritual, it was a wedding. In front of his family, Silas Cain declared Elspeth his celestial wife, bound by a covenant older than the laws of man. He proclaimed that their union would create a new generation of prophets, children born of pure, uncorrupted blood. He recited passages from his own twisted gospel, words that sealed Elspeth's fate. When it was her turn to speak the vows he had written, the words came out in a choked, hollow whisper. They were words of submission, of purity, of sacrifice. They were a life sentence. By the following autumn, Elspeth was pregnant. The family celebrated it as a sign of God's favor. When she gave birth to a daughter in the dead of winter, a child who was both her daughter and her sister, they named her Eden. The child was born with a cleft palate and fingers that were fused together. Silas held her up in the lantern light and declared the deformities to be marks of divinity, proof that their blood was so pure it was becoming something other than human. This was only the start. Over the next decade, Elspeth would bear 6 more children, her own father's children. The world of Cain's Landing descended into a living nightmare. It was a place out of a madman's dream, a nursery and an asylum built on a foundation of sin. Elspeth's children, all fathered by Silas, carried the heavy, cruel burden of their heritage. Some were born with clouded eyes like their mother. Others had twisted spines or hearts that beat with a weak, fluttering rhythm. One boy never learned to speak, only to make guttural sounds from the back of his throat. But Silas Cain saw only miracles. He believed their physical suffering was a sign of their spiritual perfection. He called them his Sorrowseed, holy angels sent to bless their family. The more broken their bodies, the more convinced he became of his own divinity. He was a god in his own private Eden, and his family were his broken, beautiful creations. Elspeth herself had faded into a shell. The years of trauma, of constant pregnancy and childbirth, had erased the young girl she once was. She moved through the compound like a phantom, her mismatched eyes vacant. She cared for her children, her brothers and sisters, with a mechanical, detached tenderness. Her soul had retreated to a place no one could reach. The rest of the family was just as lost. Seraphina, her mother, had retreated completely into her faith, spending her days chanting and scrubbing floors, a constant, frantic penance for a sin she refused to name. Elspeth's siblings, warped by a lifetime of indoctrination, saw nothing wrong. They had begun to follow their father's example, creating their own tangled, forbidden unions within the family. By 1930, nearly 24 people lived at Cain's Landing, a knot of humanity so tightly wound, so genetically intertwined, that nature itself was screaming in protest. The isolation that had been their shield was now their tomb. And Silas, his hair now white but his eyes still burning with righteous fire, had begun to look upon his own granddaughters, Elspeth's children, with a chilling, prophetic gleam. The cycle was preparing to begin anew. But the outside world, silent for so long, was about to knock on their door. Arthur Vance was a man of numbers and straight lines. As a census taker for the United States government, his job was to make order out of chaos, to count and categorize, to fit every household into a neat little box on his form. But nothing in his life could have prepared him for the chaos he found at the end of a forgotten dirt track in the Arkansas Ozarks. He first saw the smoke from a ridge line, rising from a valley his maps said was empty. Curiosity and a dogged sense of duty compelled him forward. The scene that greeted him was from another time. A cluster of dilapidated cabins, crawling with children who seemed wrong. children with vacant, clouded eyes and twisted limbs who stared at him with a mixture of fear and animal curiosity. The adults moved like shadows, their faces blank, their clothes little more than rags. And then he saw her. A woman who looked both ancient and young, with one blue eye and one white, surrounded by a brood of broken children who clung to her dress, calling her Mama. At the center of it all stood Silas Cain. He greeted Arthur with a charismatic, unnerving smile, his Bible held tight in one hand. He spoke of his family as a flock, a congregation sealed off from the evils of the modern world. He answered Arthur's questions with cryptic biblical deflections. The names he gave, the relationships he described, none of it made sense. The family tree he sketched out was a tangled, impossible web. Arthur Vance left Cain's Landing that day with a cold dread settling in his stomach. The numbers didn't add up. The story didn't make sense. He had looked into the eyes of Elspeth Cain, and what he saw there was a horror that no ledger could ever contain. His report to the county sheriff was hesitant, filled with phrases like unusual family structure and concerns for welfare. But it was enough. The investigation that followed was a slow, agonizing process. When the sheriff and his deputies finally made their way up to Cain's Landing, they were met with a wall of silent, hostile faith. The family, coached by Silas, refused to speak. It took months of careful, patient work, of separating the younger members from Silas's suffocating influence, for the full, sickening truth to finally spill out. The court proceedings were a spectacle of horror. Doctors testified to the devastating genetic consequences of generations of incest. One by one, Elspeth's siblings broke their silence, their stories tumbling out in a torrent of confusion and shame. They described the rituals, the doctrine, the life they had been forced to lead, the monster they had called father. Silas Cain never stood trial. He was found one morning in his jail cell, having used his own leather belt to escape the judgment of a world he despised. He took the full truth of his doctrine, the depths of his madness, with him to the grave. Elspeth and her children were taken from the mountain, removed from the only world they had ever known. But they were not saved. They were broken beyond repair. Elspeth lived out her days in a state psychiatric hospital, forever lost between the world of her father's making and a world she could never understand. She would spend hours staring at her own reflection, a stranger with one blue eye and one white, whispering fragments of the gospel that had been both her religion and her curse. The cabins at Cain's Landing were burned to the ground by order of the state, an attempt to cleanse the land of the stain it held. But a story like that doesn't just disappear. It seeps into the soil. It becomes a part of the wind that whispers through the pines. The tale of the Sorrowseed family is a chilling testament to the darkness that can fester in isolation, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are the ones who believe they are saints. They are the ones who can twist love into a weapon and faith into a cage. And in the forgotten hollows of the Ozarks, some cages are never truly broken. The ghosts just learn to live inside them.